Thank you so much for your welcome remarks, President Monaco. Welcome, everyone, to the first of 4 panels of the Tufts China-US Symposium. My name is Elsa Tung. I'm a first-year master's student here at the Fletcher School, and I organized this panel on internet freedom. And I worked on internet freedom issues in 2010 when I was a congressional staffer for a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And at the time, I helped to launch the House Global Internet Freedom Caucus. This was shortly after Google announced it would no longer censor its search results in China, and Google has subsequently pulled out its search engine services from mainland China. Recently, I haven't been as involved in internet freedom issues, but I'm delighted to introduce someone who has, our panel moderator, Jake Fromer. Jake is a second-year master's student at the Fletcher School studying Pacific Asia and international security. Prior to his enrollment at Fletcher, Jake spent 3 years in Beijing as a teacher at an international elementary school and a volunteer translator for 2 environmental websites. Last summer, Jake interned at the Beijing Bureau of the New York Times, where he contributed reporting, research, and translation to articles about politics, dissidents, history, and culture. His own bylines in the Times included stories about Beijing's infrastructure problems after a flood. Jake is writing his master's thesis on the spread of foreign ideas in China, with a particular focus on how Weibo, China's microblogs, allow Chinese netizens to observe and discuss democratic elections in Taiwan and South Korea. Welcome, Jake.
Hello? Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Elsa, and thank you. Elsa actually organized this panel. I'm just the moderator, so let's give her a round of applause. Definitely deserves it. So, as you all know, we're here to talk about the internet in China, which is, well, as you heard, one of my favorite topics. Maybe by the end of the session, it'll be your favorite topic too, when it comes to thinking about China. It's really important, and to illustrate that, I just want to give you a few numbers. I don't want to make anyone's eyes glaze over with numbers, but I think these really illustrate how powerful this subject is. According to the China Internet Network Information Center, which is a government body that deals with the internet in China, it's an official organ. So these statistics are probably where you'd go if you want to have information about how many people in China are using the internet. There were 564 million internet users in China at the end of 2012, which is about 8% of the world. So 8% of all mankind is a Chinese internet user. So we're dealing with a big topic here. And of those, 300 to 400 million are active on, or at least using microblogs, something like Twitter, although in China they can't access Twitter easily, so it's usually a domestic piece of software. So we have a population the size of the United States, maybe even bigger, that's going on microblogs in China. Of those, 200 million can use their cell phones to get on the microblog. So you can imagine, as smartphones get cheaper and go into the countryside and places that didn't originally have nice technology like that, you can imagine the implications of that when somebody sees someone doing something that isn't right or isn't good or is damaging to property or the environment or another person, and snaps a picture of it and posts it online, and all of a sudden, in theory, 1/8 of humanity can see it at the snap of a finger. And I think that's why this is such an important topic. It's important to the government in China. It's important to anybody trying to understand China and the dynamics between the people themselves and between the people and the government there. And President Monaco mentioned trust. This trust definitely applies here between the people and the government, and between China and the U.S., as Elsa mentioned, the Google situation. Maybe that'll come up at some point today. Anyways, I'll quickly introduce our panelists. I'm really excited to be here talking with them. Sarah Cook is a senior research analyst for East Asia at Freedom House. I know a lot of Fletcher students look at their materials for research. She leads the editorial team producing the China Media Bulletin, which is a bi-weekly news digest of media freedom developments related to the PRC, to China. Her comments and writings have appeared on CNN, the International Herald Tribune, the international version of the New York Times, and the Taipei Times, as well as the U.S. Congressional Executive Commission on China. She has master's degrees in politics and international law from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Our second panelist is Rob Faris. He's the research director of the Beekman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. His recent research includes internet content regulation, state censorship, and surveillance practices, as well as broadband and infrastructure policy, and the interaction of new media, online speech, government regulation of the internet, and political processes. And Dr. Faris actually is a Fletcher alum. He has a master's and PhD from the Fletcher School, so we're happy to welcome him back here. And then finally, our third panelist is David Wertime. David is the co-founder and editor and co-editor of Tea Leaf Nation, which is an English-language online magazine that synthesizes and analyzes Chinese social media. I look at this site every day, probably more than once a day, or every afternoon, then every night. I look at it too much. It's an amazing site. I really think everybody should check it out. And I know that anybody who is even remotely interested in what's happening in China today and what the Chinese people, if you want to say it like that, are thinking, everybody goes on this site. It's huge. And his writing has also appeared on The Atlantic and the Huffington Post, as well as on the Tea Leaf Nation. So he's a graduate of Harvard Law School. So this is a really good panel here. I think we should all be very excited about it. And as we go into the first question, I just wanted to leave you all with a quote, which is actually from a Fletcher School alum who is now the ambassador to the United Kingdom from China. His name is Liu Xiaoming. And he said, let me find my quote. He was interviewing with BBC, and they were talking about internet censorship. And the BBC interviewer said to him, if one of our China correspondents goes to China and wants to get on Facebook or Twitter, he can't. And this was Fletcher alum Liu Xiaoming's response. If you're in China and get connected to the internet, I think you can get all kinds of opinions. It's very open, and a lot of things can be debated, including politics, economics, and cultural affairs. So that is so Fletcher alum Liu Xiaoming completely denies that there is censorship, or at least goes around the problem and refuses to admit it, which leads me to the first question. Is he right? How open is China's internet? Well, this is the internet age. How open is China in the internet age? How open is it? Yeah, this is to everybody.
So I was thinking about this. Oh, can you hear me okay? There. I think a lot of it comes down to how you define openness. I think if you define it as Chinese people being able to access the internet in terms of getting access to the technology, being able to access video sharing websites, microblogging platforms, then just as Jake was describing in terms of these staggering numbers, then people have access to that. I think if you're talking about people then being able to do things like share family photos and talk about their vacation and do a lot of the things that if you think about what your friends post on Facebook all the time, then Chinese people have a lot of opportunity. Chinese internet users have a tremendous amount of opportunities to do that. I think if it's in terms of posting certain information with regards to politics and social social affairs and things that are happening in their society, they certainly have more opportunities to talk and share and access information about these topics than they did previously or in any other medium in China. But there's a big but, and I think if you really look at the barriers to and the obstacles and the system that the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government have set up for managing and controlling what Chinese people do online once they have access, then you see that there's actually quite a closed ecosystem here. And I think we're going to talk more about the specific controls, but I think we've all heard about the Great Firewall, about the way in which there are actual gateways that internet traffic in China passes through if you want to reach content that's based on servers outside of China. But what the Chinese government has been very successful at doing is that it's not just that you don't have access to certain websites. Even if you access a website that's available, the speed, for instance, is much slower than if you're accessing a website within the firewall. And for various reasons, there's just been, especially over the last, I would say, 5 years, even more so, a consolidation where a tremendous amount, most of the traffic stays within the Great Firewall. And that's been something that sometimes is due to technical reasons, sometimes it's due to the fact that the platforms people are using to share information and all their friends are on it. And so if you're talking about openness or closed, it's actually quite a closed, introverted system. The other thing I would say just on this question is also, I think looking at China overall is the difference between openness and freedom. Because the fact, there's a lot of openness in China, and you can see, oh, well, that person wrote this and they said that, and look, that person wrote and they were able to criticize it. That person was able to take a picture of the official beating up, a petitioner and dragging him away. So you have that, but I think the question is, does that equate to freedom? Because first of all, that post can be deleted. It may be up there for a minute, but then it'll be taken down 24 hours later, or maybe it'll be taken down a week later when for whatever reason you have a lot of censorship that happens retroactively. And maybe it may be that person who then took that photo will be detained. And you know what? They might not be detained now. We've had several cases recently of people and activists who had been writing all kinds of things, and they get brought up on these murky subversion charges about something they wrote 5 years ago. So if there's keeping tabs on internet users and what they're writing, well, then how free are they really to be writing these things? And then of course there's the question that once you get pulled in on those kinds of charges, what kind of protections do you have? Is there an independent court? Are you able to have access to a lawyer? On freedom of expression cases in particular, you're very unlikely. Criminal cases in general in China, but especially freedom of expression cases, it's very, very, very difficult to get. To be found not guilty, even if what you did actually technically didn't violate China's own laws. So I think when people look at some of the ratings with regards to how Freedom House, when we look at China, for instance, our Internet Freedom Index is on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being the best and 100 being the worst. And China is deeply in the not free category. It scores an 85. And I think it's really a big part of that is because of this distinction between, I would say, openness and freedom, and the arbitrariness, the rules, and the protections that users may or may not have. So I'll stop there. I don't want to speak for too long.
So I think this microphone should work. Is it working? Is it on? Great. So it's wonderful to be back here. As Jake said, I was a student back here. My studies started in 1993. I sat in this very auditorium for orientation. I remember it very well. I had an AOL account back then, and it said, "You've got mail." When I had an email, it would come in. There was almost no spam. If I wanted to read an article, I had to go to the library. If I wanted to hear a talk, I actually had to physically show up in the location. So I'm very appreciative of all of you who have come out today through the rain. A big thanks to Elsa and Jake for organizing this. So obviously the world has changed dramatically since then, and in China, it's more open there in almost every respect compared to 20 years ago, and a lot of that is by virtue of digital activity, so there's no question about that. There are areas that are not as open as some people would care them to be, and that is a fairly small but very, very crucial and important part of life, I would argue. The one distinction I'd like to draw, just to open things off, is between access to information and ideas and facts and the ability to organize online. I think the thing that internet commentators have typically overestimated to a great extent is the impact of access to information on social and political life. The notion that just throwing ideas out there, the access to different ideas, the full range of ideas, is going to change the world. Most people have backed off on those simple, certainly those simple kind of techno-utopian ideas of political change. We, of course, know that political change, that good governance, that freedom of the press, all these things are built upon multi-layered institutions that are made up of networks and coalitions of people, and that online organizing is now filling a very important niche in that space in places around the world. And I think one of the key distinctions that we should draw in China is that access to information is quite open. That if people want to find out about a political event or people or places, despite the layers of content controls that are put there, these things tend to travel around and they're out there. The more difficult part of things, which is creating communities and bringing communities together. I'm not online, am I? Yeah? Would it be better if I go through that? Yeah. So it's this distinction between online organizing and passing ideas around is not lost on the regulators in China, and it's very clear that they are much more intent on providing obstacles or inhibiting political organization online, and they're much more serious about that. I'd recommend a study by Gary King and his colleagues at Harvard. Some folks are nodding there. They looked at the posts taken down on various social media platforms, I think primarily Weibo, and they found that the difference between posts that stayed up online and those that were taken down were not really a function of the degree to which they were critical of the government. More importantly, they found that the distinction between that which stayed up and went down was more a function of the degree to which the posts were trying to incite some kind of collective action or community formation, which I think is very, very important in telling. Leave it there. Pass the mic.
Thanks. I think this might be working. I'll start with this, and if it doesn't work, I'll go to that. Thank you. These are both, I think, wonderful introductions to the Chinese web and important distinctions, that between access to information and the ability to organize, and that between freedom and openness. So to answer the particular question as precisely as I can, I think if you ask how open is the Chinese internet, I would say it is probably more open than many outside observers would expect, but not as open as it could be or should be. And how open is China? I would say, and how has the internet in China played into China's openness? I would say China is more open than it probably would be without the internet, but not as open as it could be or should be. And it's very hard to put a degree on that. But I think, speaking personally, my departure point is my experience from 2001 to 2003 as a Peace Corps volunteer in a small city in the Chinese interior. And going from that to today and seeing how much easier it is to gauge sentiment within China and to gain access to people's hopes, people's complaints, people's dreams, simply by reading the internet, is absolutely astonishing to me. I could have never imagined that level of access or that level of candor when I was on the ground in China in 2001. And so for me, I think the power of the Chinese social web is quite evident, if only because it contrasts so starkly with my earliest experiences in the country. Now, when we talk about the Chinese internet, obviously, that's a pretty broad term, and some have described it more aptly as a Chinese intranet, that because of the so-called Great Firewall, which keeps out sites like Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, it's more of a self-contained system with its own counterparts to Web 2.0 platforms that we take for granted here in the United States. In particular, instead of Twitter or Facebook, you have something called Weibo. And Weibo literally means microblog in Chinese. There's a few different versions of it. The most popular one is Sino-US, which has hundreds of millions of users, and how many of them are active is open for debate, but at least 50 million of them are very active, and probably another 50 million are sort of active, and that's still a lot. And so I think when you look at the Chinese internet, there's a few things that are helpful to keep in mind. And the first is its social role. I think because of the lack of other democratic institutions that transmit grassroots sentiment to the political level, because of the lack of platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and because of the lack of other platforms for free speech and debate, the Chinese social web, and in particular Sino-Weibo, is immensely, I think, infused with promise and also fraught with disappointment. And I think that that duality is important to understanding the Chinese web. And it provides a number of things, both for citizens there and for observers on the outside. I think many have said that it's actually a steam valve, that because you can go online and you can complain about something, you don't actually get that impetus to go out onto the street or to take action in your community. And so some have argued that the Chinese government uses the Chinese social web in order to deter, in order to give just enough leeway to citizens that they don't feel driven into a higher level of action. And that's surely true in certain cases. At the same time, as I said, it's the closest thing that China has to a platform for free speech, free debate, breaking news on some of the sensitive issues of the day. Again, that's surely true. That doesn't mean that it's free. But if you look at the available alternatives, it's surely among the freest. And finally, I would say its value is as a window, both for us on the outside as Americans, as foreigners who are looking into China, and for those within China too. Both the Chinese government and Chinese citizens use it that way. For the Chinese government, it's a way to gauge sentiment on the ground, to determine what people are willing to give you a pass on and what people really feel strongly about. And for other Chinese citizens too, I think it's a window into the larger zeitgeist of the age. And I think that's actually tremendously important and underestimated as a motive force. Because if you have a minority opinion in China, you can now go online, and even if you're not an active web user, you can get a sense of, okay, there are 10,000 people who agree with me. And I think that's actually very powerful in ways that we can't yet anticipate or quantify. So that's my best shot at answering that question.
Thanks so much. That's great. First of all, I forgot to let everybody know, I'm going to be asking some questions first, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So please, if you think of a good question, write it down so you can ask it at the end. We'll probably have a half hour for audience Q&A, so come up with some good ones, please. So my next question is going to go to Sarah. Of course, anyone else is welcome to jump in. And I don't know if you are Quentin Tarantino fans, but his newest film, Django Unchained, was supposed to go to China. China has quotas on how many foreign films can come in every year, and Django somehow made it in. And there were reports that, Tarantino was going to kind of, I guess, change the color of the blood to make it more pleasing to a Chinese audience. I don't really know what that means or why that would even be the case. I don't understand that logically. But anyways, that's how he was going to do it. And then the movie was released, and then from what I read, a few minutes into the opening session around the country, they decided to just cut it and said, you know what, we're not going to do this. People, called from above and told the movie theaters to shut it down. So with that, I'm going to get to the second question, which is, how does censorship work in China? I know we're talking about the internet. Maybe you can go into a little, just briefly, just in general, because they don't just censor the internet in China. And when I say they, we'll get into that into a later question too. But can you explain just what is censored and how it actually works, Sarah? Thanks.
Okay, this is a big question. We have an 8,000 word report about how internet censorship at least works in China. Well, first I would say traditional media censorship actually works quite differently in some ways than internet censorship, and I think this has to do with issues related to ownership. So traditional, I guess film is maybe a bit different, but traditional media censorship, if you look at television censorship or newspapers, newspapers are owned at least in part by the state, and in a majority part, in some cases completely owned, and some cases very directly controlled by the Communist Party, in other cases less directly controlled, but that creates its own system with regard and incentives with regards to hiring and firing and various controls that exist in the traditional media, where the internet is very different, because if you think about these kinds of platforms like social media platforms, these are essentially private companies. And so then the relationship is a little bit different. The way in which the authorities manage how you monitor and remove content is different. That being said, the presence of the state and the Communist Party is very present, and particularly when it comes to this issue of the backbone level. What I would say about internet censorship is I would say there's three things to keep in mind in terms of, I guess, some of the features. One is the multiple layers of it. Two is the scale and the scope. And three are the nuances. So in terms of the multiple layers, when we do these assessments of internet freedom, it's not just looking at is a website censored or is there a blogger arrested. We've got about 20 different indicators, and within those multiple sub-indicators, and we did a chart of internet controls, and China gets an X, at least to some degree, on each one of them. You have, in terms of, and since it's not only by censorship, that's the thing. So you have on the one hand this great firewall, so that blocks content, people from accessing content that's on servers outside of the country, where in terms of both the legal system and in terms of the government, the political power that the authorities have to control is much weaker. Then you've got these domestic platforms, and that's where I was saying you have quite a bit of this outsourcing of the censorship and the monitoring to private entities. But then you have other layers. You have very robust surveillance. You have this propaganda dimension of commentators who are hired by the authorities to so-called guide public discussions, and some of you may have heard the term 50-cent party. And so you have that type of a strategy. You also have, of course, even though it's a relatively small percentage of internet users, the threat of imprisonment. More now you have things like shutting down of microblogging accounts, even of some very high-profile users. You have, the restrictions, the offline restrictions on online communications can range from, being harassed to being put under house arrest to being detained to being abducted to being sentenced to a long prison term. In some cases, the lighter end of the spectrum, you have more people being affected by that, but you also have a large number of people who are detained and taken and lose their personal liberties offline because of what they wrote online. And then I would say, though, is also the scale. I mean, some of the studies, the academic studies that have been done about internet censorship, just to give you a number, kind of like what Jake was saying, one study looked at, and this might have been the King study, but I don't remember if it was, 1,400 different platforms, and they estimated that about 13% of the content had been deleted, and that a lot of it had been done within 24 hours of a particular term or incident being perceived as sensitive. Another more recent study looked at the speed, and you have some cases where content is deleted within 5 minutes. So just to get a sense of like the scale of the apparatus, and I think that's also one of the things when we talk about, on the one hand, the openness and how that's changed in China. When you talk about the censorship and the experience that people have and the number of people experiencing it, that's also something that's changed. It used to be that the people who experienced the censorship apparatus directly were really just the very small percentage of people who actually worked in the media, who were professional journalists, even though, of course, indirectly, anyone who reads a newspaper or consumes media. Today, you've got possibly hundreds of thousands of people who are working on the implementation side because they're working in companies like Sino and receiving these almost daily instructions from the Communist Party or other officials about what content is permitted and what isn't permitted. And then you've got internet users, especially when there are these overkill moments where the party apparatus goes into like overdrive, and words like tomato or jasmine or today or Egypt all of a sudden are encountering censorship. And even not in those instances, just millions of people who have had this experience of trying to do what Jake was saying, it creates this level of disillusionment with the system, and that's one of the reasons why censorship itself is something that a lot of Chinese people are frustrated with. I'll just say one or two more things about what gets censored, because you were asking that, and then I'll pass it along. In addition to what Rob was saying, I think one of the things to keep in mind with regards to what gets censored, I think is a difference also between opinion and fact. One of the things that the authorities are very concerned about are actually facts and evidence of abuses, particularly instances where, what some cases it's pollution, in more cases it's things, the most severe abuses that take place in China in terms of torture and abuse, and that's where you see content being deleted particularly. And even when you look at the kinds of topics that I think anyone says are the most taboo, whether it has to do with Tibet or Xinjiang, or following people who practice the Falun Gong meditation, or what happened in 1989. One side of it relates to whether it's collective action, or relates to religious issues, or relates to perhaps territorial issues. But you also have to understand all of those also involve large numbers of people who have been subjected to some of the worst human rights abuses you can imagine. And when you look at actually the discussions in the platforms among those communities, the information that people are sending overseas, and when those moments, when even if it's not related to those communities, maybe it's related to other communities, other incidents, some of the things that create the largest outrage online and disillusionment are instances where an innocent Chinese citizen is subject to severe abuses and violence by the state. And so you actually have, that just is one example of some of the information that is also taken down. But you also have, I think a big part of it is that there isn't a clear line, and that's part of what keeps users on their toes, it keeps journalists on their toes. It's also what makes the Chinese censorship system unique because of that adaptability. So something that's not permissible today may be permissible tomorrow and vice versa. So that's one of the things where you also see this constant speed, and where, you know, on the one hand, in some cases you may have information related to environmental issues, related to health, related to product safety that may be deleted, but then on the other hand, you can also have a lot of content that is available. So that type of arbitrariness and the nuance of what's permitted or what's not is one of the things that that really characterizes also the way the censorship and communication apparatus works in China.
Sure, I'll just pile on a couple observations on that. The big difference in China compared to the rest of the world, I think, is interesting, and is that China is able to enlist the help of intermediaries, and that puts China in a unique position around the world. It's likely the envy of anyone who would want to control the internet. The rest of the countries around the world that want a YouTube video taken down, a tweet, something like that, is going to have to negotiate with Google or with Twitter. In China, they have the luxury of being able to offer alternative social media platforms, push the others out of the market, and require the intermediaries to police their own sites, which is a very powerful mechanism that is not available to any other country around the world. So that certainly sets it apart there. I think the other point about internet censorship is this is an issue that countries around the world are struggling with. Including the United States, Europe, Australia, you name it, there is a coalition for censorship in any and every one of these countries. And blocking content on the internet is just inherently a very difficult and imperfect undertaking. And the people who attempt it have the choice of either dialing it up and taking out a greater percentage of the information that you don't want out there, and in doing so, taking out a lot of innocent and harmful and productive speech, or being very, very modest in what you try to take down and missing a lot of the things. It's just, it's inherently hard and a struggle for countries around the world. On that?
I have more to say, but I think it's in response to an upcoming question. Sure.
Briefed in advance.
Sure. Yeah, my next question actually will go to Rob first, and I want to know if this is all political. We've been talking about the government's role, or is any of the censorship in China motivated by profit? This might be difficult to answer, but just because things are so opaque. But say there was a damaging report that made a company look bad, I don't know, Sinopec or one of the big oil companies or one of the the big media companies in China, or anything, made them look bad, would they go to the government, or can they, and say, please take this down? Because in that case, it wouldn't necessarily be political, it would be profit motivated. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, I can speculate. It's a black box, and knowing what individual actors are able to ask for and achieve, we don't know. I don't think. Maybe someone here does. It's an interesting mix of economic and political and other motives that go into this. Certainly, the official description of why things are blocked and the rationales for doing it is one animal, and then there's political and economic things that underlie it. It's hard to separate them as well because the political ends are often consistent with the economic ends. I just mentioned the blocking of prominent social media sites, or even the New York Times. I mean, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, you name it. They're blocked often enough that they can't really effectively compete in Chinese markets. And that's very helpful for the domestic industries there, and they've succeeded with the help of that. But that's also consistent with political ends, so it's hard to unravel those two. Could the oil company go and ask for something to be taken down because it's against China's economic interests? They certainly could, and I think if they made the right argument, they could succeed in doing that. The question we don't know, and which we would love to know, is what's the real economic impact of censorship in China? Not only in China, but in any country around the world. And China is a particularly vexing example for those that would like to make the case that censorship is damaging to economic growth. I mean, what would we think that economic growth would have been without censorship? It would have been 12% a year over the past decade. I mean, China has been very, very successful with this regime put in place. That might change in the future, but I think, our best guesses so far has been that really hard to establish that it's hurt in terms of economic growth. Political reform, perhaps, even that is, we don't have a counterfactual, and we don't know what to compare that against. So I think I probably answered a different question in doing so, but.
Maybe David remembers the details of this better. There was a scandal recently that was exposed about, not so much about companies going to the government, but going to the social media sites. So some scandals about whether the Baidu search engine there were people there who were being paid to change search results, or also people like a certain market that had developed for the deletion of certain damaging posts. And